I'm Everly Ito Pinson,
Kimberly Kisunalirasan,
inviting you to be with us all the way in the morning for the latest news in our locality, regional, national, and from the foreign shore.
more headlines news coming up, and please watch the complete details. Because we'll be right back after a short reminder.
For the details of our news, Chapter 4, Books and Publishing.
Chapter 5, Newspapers.
Chapter 6, Magazine.
Chapter 7, Radio and the Birth of Electronic Journalism.
The birth of publishing. Do you know that Pratt is the most influential figure in the publishing industry? You heard it right. While authors may, by reflex, conclude that this refers to a publisher of their acquaintance, and publishers will likely conclude the reverse. The main character here is a real rat, a rodent who jumped ship in France sometime around 1350. The invention and development of printing. By early 1400s, this recycling trend was coupled with other technological developments and produced a booming paper industry. There was just one problem. Documents still had to be laboriously hand-copied by scribes, and most of the scribes had perished in the flood. Those who survived charged outrageously high price, and some sort of movable type would answer the problem and in the process makes its inventor rich. The Gothenburg Press. The, a metalsmith in Mainz, Germany, named Johann Gutenberg had been experimenting with various metals and alloys and found a proper mixture. A mixture that could be heated and molded but still set up hard enough to impress a precise image. He also significantly improved the technique of making the molds from which the individual letters would be made, and the method by which the letters would held in place during the printing process. His press caught on like wildfire, and within 40 years, there were presses in more than 100 cities. The press changes society. Christopher Columbus was a great fan of the Gothenburg Press. He arranged for the printing of small pamphlets which would become known as news books that were distributed in advance of his visits to European cities. Those visits were primarily fundraising events because Columbus had to collect money to finance his trips to the New World and as prerequisite needed to sway the opinion of the public and its rulers. The spread of dissent at the Gothenburg Press. The Gothenburg Press also helped dissidents spread political and religious views. Martin Luther was a Catholic priest who attacked his church for allowing the sale of indulgences, meaning church-sponsored forgiveness of sins based on good deeds. Luther's religious tracts were printed and distributed throughout Europe, reaching what was for the time a huge audience. Kings and queens recognized the power of the press to get their benefits. However, also recognized that the press could be a powerful tool against them. The book becomes a target for suppression. Books are influential and they are tangible, symbols of an idea that can held in the hand or tossed in the fire. Book banning, which sometimes culminates in the act of book burning, has a long pedigree. In the 3rd century BC, the Chinese Emperor Shi Huangdi thousands of books in the emperor's library, saving only books about farming, law, and medicine. He also ordered the torture and murder of dissident intellectuals. Book burning often underlies the theme that knowledge is a threat to a dictator. Hitler was perhaps the biggest book burners in history, ruling that any book not receiving official approval be cast into enormous fire ceremonially lit in Berlin. Censorship of books is not always so dramatic. Sometimes it's assumed a bureaucratic institutional tone. The Catholic Church issued an index of forbidden books in 1559 and published editions regularly until the 1960s. Over 4,000 books were listed. The press changes America. The printing press in America was first used for religious books, such as the Babe Psalm book, the first book printed in the colonies in 1640. Common Sense and the Revolutionary War. Important political books in the colonies would probably be more accurately described as pamphlets, but nonetheless they were influential. A slim volume by Thomas Dane proved to be one of the most influential books in history. Next, the books become a popular mass medium. The post-revolutionary period saw works by writers such as Washington Irving, John Penniman Cooper, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Before the Civil War, another politically influential book, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harold Baker Stowe, changed the political landscape by making a powerful case for abolishing slavery. By the mid to late 1800s, technology had driven the prices of books down, and popular works such as books by Horatio Alger found their way in the hands of everyday Americans. The young novels surfaced in the mid to late 1800s. These are short, cheaply manufactured books, usually with paper rather than hard cloth covers, that usually featured adventure stories and westerns. Next, the literature becomes an agent of social change. America became a truly prominent literary power around the turn of the next century. Again, the book became a powerful motivator for change and reform. Next, the books as cultural shorthand. The ability of books to capsulize our feelings is one of the medium's great strengths. Never underestimate the power of good story. Legend and narrative often prove more meaning than straight recitation of fact. And the book, the most personal mass media method of one person relaying a story to another, has long been enormously influential in shaping personal mass our view of social conditions. Many of these stories are virtually hardwired into our brains after years of exposure to them. Lastly, nonfiction books become a mechanism for personal development. The nonfiction book was equally important through these periods and had profound effects in ways you may not immediately realize. One such change has to do with public education. Most of us only appreciate free access to information after it is taken away. Textbooks and how-to books are both a reflection of 20th century culture and significant contributors to that culture. Today, there is an ever-flowing love of books offering advice on practically any topic, and troubled people often head to the bookstore to find a solution to their problems. Reporting live here in Poblacion Trinidad, Bohol, this is Gisa Nantes for TNC News. Thank you.
The paperback engineers growth in the publishing industry. During the post-war era, the paperback helped move publishing into the arena of big business. To put this in perspective, note that World War II and the Civil War, 80 years earlier, were both instrumental in making the paperback viable. The previously mentioned Horatio Alger stories were a staple of this period. Paperbacks also became a cheap way to pirate books, especially those of foreign authors. The Copyright Act of 1891 changed that, granting authors from overseas a royalty, and the paperback industry went into a slump. paperbacks during World War II, but it made a comeback shortly before and during World War II. Americans hungered for an entertaining alternative to the grind of stoking a frantic wartime economy. After the war ended in 1945, the nation took a breather and then set about devoting the energy that had been usurped by war into carving out the idyllic version of prosperous life. The paperback explosion of the 50s. The 50s, as we know today, have been short-handed by the popular culture, and many of us characterize this as the era of Leave It to Beaver, a time when suburban families were stunningly normal and comfortable, and for some reason wore high heels, dresses, suits, and cardigan sweaters while hanging around the house. And normalcy, after about 5 years of being consumed by war, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin was a leader in this nation's witch hunt and was reckless in making accusations and indifferent to the suffering he caused. The book industry of the 50s became fueled by sales of paperbacks, reference books, and textbooks, and became, in spite of itself, big business. Publishing goes corporate. Publishing had never been known before this time as a particularly profitable nor well-organized enterprise. It was sometimes characterized as a gentleman's business, where editors and publishers worked by instinct, published many works they felt had great artistic merit but little chance of commercial success, and did many a deal over lunch and consumed it with a handshake. But when money began to rule after the post-war expansion, the publishing world became a profit center and attracted outside investment. Many went public or were acquired by the large publicly owned corporations. How the book industry operates. The modern publishing company often orchestrates activity among a wide variety of independent contractors and freelancers. Most of the publishing industry remains centered in New York. Some publishing houses specialize in a certain type of book, such as reference, textbooks, or novels. Others produce a diverse mixture of book types, often producing the books with various divisions of the company. In fact, one of the most well-known publishers, Random House, was born with this strategy in mind. Beneath Cerf, the founder vowed to publish at random various high-quality books that came his way, regardless of category. So here are some type of books. Here are more specific the types of book published. Books are grouped into 5 categories: trade, religious, professional or technical, and textbooks. Trade means any book that is sold to the general public through regular bookstores and sold to libraries. This includes fiction and non-fiction. Within non-fiction, the term trade covers art books, biography, most general reference, how-to, and so forth. Professional or technical. These books are for specialists in various fields such as law, medicine, real estate, engineering, and architecture. A textbook generally contains special features that enhance the educational value. Those features refer to the publishing industry as apparatus, often include chapter summarizes, and so forth. Religious books. Bibles, hymnals, and similar works are the mainstay of publishers in this category. Mass market paperbacks. This is another category that is partly defined by the point of sale. Mass market paperbacks are sold in department, grocery, and drugstores. Sometimes, but not always, they are for cheaper paper and cover stock in the trade paperbacks. Categories within categories. It is obvious that there are many subcategories within these broad classifications. In non-fiction, books are usually grouped as references, biography, business, personal development, how-to, health, history, and so forth. Fiction publishers often use as the word category fiction to describe any fiction that has a discrete handle: romance, mystery, horror, crime. The other type of fiction, anything not in a category, is sometimes called the mainstream or literary novel. A mainstream or literary novel is a work with considerable literary merit dealing with an important issue. Occasionally, a mystery will be reviewed and given the compliment as good as a mainstream novel. The organization of a publishing house. The head of the house is usually called the publisher or president. A special type of editor known as the acquisitions editor is sometimes placed in overcharge of securing new works. Editors at many levels change, correct, and supervise revisions. Sometimes, these are called development editors or project editors. Copy editors painstakingly correct errors of grammar, spelling, and fact in the author's copy. The designer, sometimes called the design editor, is in charge of the look of the book, typeface, page design, cover, and so forth. A production editor is in charge of making the whole project materialize into a book. He or she will supervise the project from initial manuscript to galleys, which are initial copies of that typeset manuscript usually reviewed for accuracy and style by the author. To page proof, the final incorporation of art and text to be checked by the author, editor, and designer to bound books. How an idea becomes a book. Book publishing is a fairly democratic enterprise. People of all ages, appearances, races, sexes, and political persuasions can get a book published. How authors approach publishers. The way authors sell their books to publishers depends on the category of book. First, novels are usually sold as a complete manuscript. Non-fiction authors generally sell their project based on a detailed outline and usually one or more sample chapters. Manuscripts or chapters and outlines are submitted to publishers in two ways: over the transom and through a literary agent. Over the transom is an expression that dates back to the days before central air conditioning, when most offices had a crossbeam over the door to the hallway. And over the transom submission is simply one that comes through the mail unsolicited. A literary agent is a representative of one or more authors. He or she sells the manuscript or book idea and negotiates the contract for a share of the advance and royalties. The publishing industry used to employ many entry-level workers in form known as first readers who would give through the over-the-transom submissions. The item central to the most negotiation is, of course, money. The rest level in publishing a new book. And one of the frustrating aspects of the business for everyone involved that there are few sure things except for books by authors such as King and Clancy. The frustration for authors and publishers is compounded by the notion expressed so well by Kenny Rogers in the song The Gambler. Every hand's a winner and every hand's a loser. In short, you can win with a weak hand if conditions are right, and lose with a powerful hand if conditions are bad or if you play it poorly. The Kane Mutiny, a winner book that went and became the blockbuster movie, would have been a loser if the author had given up after his 26th rejection. New technologies such as digital and multimedia applications do threaten in the book, but the traditional book is a very durable technology. The book, as we know, it is a highly refined technology, even though it is a very old technology with some aspects of that technology, such as the chapters and page numbering, dating back the Roman Empire. The book continues to do today what is done since its invention, influence thought and sometimes inflame sentiments. Reporting live here in Bienvenido, this is Judy Garcia Torsendi for TMC News.
Thank you, Ms. Jessa and Ms. Judy, for the Chapter 4 report. Now, let's hear for the Chapter 5 reporters.
chains of information that help an expanding world keep tabs on affairs back home and commerce in the rest of the world. A flamboyant self-described HOB wanted to make his new national newspaper compete with television. He took a direct approach. New Hearts Transform was a stage drama, a management technique that eventually produced results. USA Today hit rocky waters after publication, started in 1982, and for several years it virtually hemorrhaged money. 19th century papers did this too, in fact, a newspaper as we know. Principles and practices of journalism, a modern example with historical precedent. From the beginning of USA, today New Holland was insistent to the point of fantasism about the front page beckoning readers and buyers. It was designed for the mobile community of the late 20th century. It was a national newspaper that had many features especially designed specifically for travelers. The bulk of the USA population was no longer confined to major cities in the Northeast. The paper significantly cut distribution costs by transmitting to entirely out by satellite to printing plants around the country. Some argue that publication is superficial and gives short shrift to real news. In 59 BC, Caesars ordered a written record of the facts of the day or the acta posted in public places. Some members of the far-flung Roman Empire commanded the resource to receive handwritten news, he says. The printing press did not support the immediate production of publication that truly resembled used books. The oldest known newspaper written in English, the Coronto, was published in 1620. The newspapers may or may not be newspapers, although they certainly qualify as the direct ancestors of today's newspapers. In 1702, the Courant became the first English daily. Public Occurrences was published in 1690, but only one issue lasted. A story alleging the King of France had slept with his son's brat, says Sally Kahn. The first regularly published newspaper was officially licensed by the British Crown. It was a dull paper focusing on shipping news and sanitized political stories. The era of licensing and enforcement of libel are events that have direct connection to the way the American press system. A paper called the New England Courant was published in 1721. The paper, edited through the jailhouse door, broke the back of licensing writers John Peter Ginger and the New York Weekly Journal. The law made no allowance for this, he says. John Avlon, it's seductively easy to read too much into these cases. He says newspaper involved hand in hand with the social conditions of the nation, but they grow along a pattern that was chronological related to changes in national culture, demographic patterns, and advances in the available technology. Reporting live here in Balintawak, Talibon, Bohol, this is Anariza Budinsado for TMC News.
Media historians often segment the evolution of American newspapers: the partisan press era, colonial times to 1833, the penny press era, 1833 to 1865, the yellow journalism era, 1865 to 1900, the modern era, 1900 to the present. The modern era described in two movements. The first is jazz journalism in the 1920s. The second is alternative or new journalism, roughly the 1960s to the present. The partisan press era, colonial times to 1833. Partisan had the same root as party. These papers usually appealed toward the elite, that part of the population that was highly literated and had enough money to buy a paper. The Federalist Papers, arguments in favor of adopting the Constitution, were published in newspapers. Colonists were accustomed to reading the fiery, separatist rhetoric of Thomas Paine. Technology of the era dictated small press runs. because printers were limited to creaking hand-operated press. So the penny press era 1833 to 1865. We usually link the start of this era to the first issue of the New York Sun, a paper published by Benjamin Jay. The Sun sold for a penny and contained a mix of crime news and feature stories. It was unabashedly a paper of the or for the common man and woman. James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald improved on basic formula by adding an editorial page and financial news. Some papers like the One Penny New York Tribune, published by Horace Greeley, the penny press and had a changing audience. The penny press capitalized on the public's growing thirst for news of the community. And when a largely industrialized population moved into cities, they established a ready market for local news as well as lighter human interest, fare that distracted them from what were often brutal work days in the factories established during the Industrial Revolution. So, effects of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a period of industrial growth that began in England about 1750 and spread to the United States in the next century. Invention of machines such as steam engine changed population and manufacturing patterns. Steam engines could not be used in the home like spinning wheels could, and therefore necessitated the construction of factories. Manufacturing methods changed in many ways, but foremost was the introduction of specialization to the process. Specialization of labor also was become part of the penny press. The penny press era was very much a product of the technology of the time. The penny press and the run up to the Civil War. Race issues were at the heart of the Civil War, but although some publications attacked slavery, many publications were apathetic or outright hostile. The New York Sun's motto was, "It shines for all." But an editor once told a protester that the sun shines for all white men, but not for colored men. That protester, Willis A. Hodges, was told that if he wanted to express the view of blacks, he should start his own paper, which he did. It was called the Ram's Horn, and Frederick Douglass was named editor. Douglass was an escaped slave who was an exceptional public speaker. Douglass founded his own paper, the North Star, in 1847. It was later called Frederick Douglass Paper. The North Star advocated abolition of slavery, as did its cultural ancestor, Freedom's Journal, which began publication in 1827. Around the turn of the century, several such papers were published and a few are still operating today, including the Amsterdam News in New York and the Chicago Defender. As we have previously discussed, the development of war services, news services that sent reports by telegraph to many papers, began to change the nature of news, ostensibly supplying reports that were more objective than those in the partisan press era. This chapters in depth looks back at this issue. When Samuel Morse refined his telegraph, he not only put the Pony Express out of business, but made it possible for a group of newspapers to pool their resources and form the Associated Press, the first nationwide electronic news service. Media analyst W. Lance Bennett, in his book News, The Politics of Illusion, argues that the lack of purported objectivity may have actually been a plus. So Bennett's assertion, a common one, is that objectivity was born as a business practice but soon became a value. Journalism professor Conrad Fink, though, maintains that it became clear that the value of objectivity is clearly not practically possible, and the AP turned it into an ideal. Veteran reporter Bill Moyers points out perhaps the real problem is assuming that such objectivity is really possible. The yellow journalism era 1865 to 1900. Yellow journalism has come to be known as reckless, inflammatory reporting designed to stir sentiment and, in the process, sell papers. That term was coined because of a comic strip carried in a newspaper of the era that featured a boy who wore a yellow sack-like shirt. Two New York newspaper publishers, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, locked horns in a fierce circulation war, and Hearst hired away the cartoonist who drew the cartoon. Pulitzer claimed he owned the rights to the Yellow Kid cartoon, hired another artist to draw it, and for a while New York had two yellow papers. Pulitzer and Hearst. Pulitzer and Hearst and their respective papers, the New York World and the New York Journal, are symbols of the yellow journalism era. Pulitzer, a Hungarian immigrant, came to New York from St. Louis where he had owned the Post-Dispatch. In St. Louis, Pulitzer hit on a winning formula of crusades, exposes of corruption, crime, and sex. Hearst came from California, where his father owned the San Francisco Examiner. The younger Hearst had worked for Pulitzer's World, and not only learned the formula but he believed he could improve on it. In a dramatic showdown, Hearst bought the ailing New York Journal and came to New York prepared to out Pulitzer. The battle was joined in a stream of outrageous headlines, lurid reports of crime and sex, and in an incident that symbolized the entire era, incendiary reports about the trouble brewing in Cuba, an island which was at that time was controlled by Spain. Reporting live here in Biabasubay, this is Kimberly Lirasan. Once again, good morning.
Hearst was a jealous advocate of military action against Spain, the Spanish-American War in 1898. Legend has it in the early stage of the confrontation between US and Spain. Hearst dispatched an artist named Frederick Remington to do sketches for the paper. Remington wrote, "Everything is quiet. There is no trouble here. There will be no war. I wish to return. Please remain here, finish the pictures, and I'll finish the war. I'm not blaming you." War did break out, and part of the cause indisputably was Hearst's treatment of an explosions abroad, an American battleship they Maine. The Yellow Press, caused by the US, won easily, thumping Spain in a series of battles that included Teddy Roosevelt, changed up San Juan Hill in Cuba. William Randolph Hearst Krellman would later recall his shock that the man who had provoked this war had come to see the result with his own eyes. The yellow was a product of its cultural time in that it was concerned with the abuse of power and the world affairs. Democratic pattern feed the fortnight of the social inequality prime subject for the yellow press. Crusader. Pulitzer himself, an immigrant, was a crusader against immigrants' exploitations. Technology, including sophisticated rotary powered presses, enable publishers to virtually flood the market with so much that 1900, in the dawn of the modern era of the market, was particularly saturated. Several papers set out of the reinvent themselves. The New York Times, which had been established as a penny paper, chain ownership becomes a powerful economic factors in the modern era. Just journalism. Modern newspaper also began to speak specialized audience, a prudent exercise, and a glutted market. During the 1920s, newspapers such as New York Daily News practiced what is sometimes called just journalism. Just journalism reporting with an emphasis on the actions, scandal, and above all pictures. The newspaper of the jazz era were designed to exploit this technology. They featured an unfolded size about 12 by 14 inches, which allowed the photo to be displayed full page photo passable. The printer's theme for the 12 by 14 inches of paper is tabloid. A standard newspaper 14 by 22 is called a broadsheet. Tabloid become former associated with visual, splashy, lurid journalism. The word is now also applied to TV programs, even though the literal use of the term obviously has no meaning. In 1960s were a time of reaching descent of the US, much of it in general reactions to the sometimes sophisticating conformity of the 50s, but most of it as specific reactions to the Vietnam War. A type of reporting building itself as an alternative to the mainstream press grew out of the era. After 1900s, the US has become not only an industrialized country but a premier center of the business management, become a specialized field of practice and studies. Newspapers like other industria becomes business like embracing a business and a corporate culture. The industry will also pay attention to its bottom, like embracing a business and corporate culture. People also wanted information on how to spend their increasing leisure time, and newspaper accommodate will have a page, movie, reviews, and other service section. Technology, once the newspaper soon began to betray its old today's scored some advances with color and satellite distribute, but one in some, the paper as we know it is now that much different from a new paper of the 1890. Other media through are vastly different in the functions from a century ago and may did not exist when newspaper ruled the media. And that is one of the problems confronting the operation of a newspaper in the 21st century. A newspaper goes to fight what is in a way an unfair battle with other media because by the definition of a newspaper product is news. Radio and television carry news but also carry entertainment. The printed page has technologically advanced. The other media may never able to entirely overcome of it. It is also important to note that newspapers are still by a large healthy and in some cases are the strongest medium of many markets. Reliable estimate put the number at about 1,400 daily newspaper in the US, a number that has shrunk considerably since the beginning of the country. Most US dailies are published in the evening. Other consist mostly of the advertising with very little news content are called shoppers. It is often estimated that there are about 20 weeklies in the US. Editorial in the usage meant anything related news. The business side handles advertising, circulation, finance, and the general administration. Newspapers are almost broken up into hierarchical departments. Under the editor is a managing editor who supervises the day-to-day news operation and also supervise a group of sub-editors. Sub-editors are in charge of the department, such as sports, regional news, financial news, travel, lifestyle, and other departments or desks that handle local news, often called the city desk or the metropolitan. Other editors supervise the staff of a copy editors, who check for factual, grammatically, and spelling errors in reporter's copy. Reporters generally work directly under the supervision of one sub-editor. Typically, the city editor has the largest response of any sub-editors. Most daily newspapers on Monday to Friday have a news holdback amount of 40% of the paper. Advertising takes other 60%. On Sunday, the ratio of 10 approaches 90%, adds to 10% news. The ratio of 60-40 in fairly standard ads newspaper typically do not go far above or below it. Most of the daily newspaper function to some extent around the clock and all content is not assembled immediately before the publication. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the latest news updates for today. Until tomorrow, same time, same station. Once again, I am Everly Igot Kimson. Good morning.
Thank you, Miss Anariza, Miss Kimberly, Miss Everly for the Chapter 5 report. Now, let's hear the Chapter 6 reporter.
Picture Magazine, the editorial strategy of compiling articles and photos of sweeping general interest made the medium of magazine tremendously successful, but in the 1950s, the general interest magazine met its match in the new medium of television. Decline of general interest magazine, television proved to be much better mass entertainment vehicles than magazine could ever hope to be. Magazine and the new lifestyle, perhaps no one understood in this concept better than the man who produced a magazine, that in these words, the select of group or vain fellows who were less concerned with a good food, drink, proper dress, and the pleasure of female company. The movement towards fighter focus, playboy, would the raw waters when the magazine lost is focus and challenged by magazine more explicit in the nature, meeting more specific desire. The modern magazine industry, there are about 12,000 publications that can be classified as magazine in United States. Categories of magazine: Magazines are usually classified by category. Number 1, consumer magazine. Number 2, trade magazine. 3, institutional magazine. And 4, newsletter. So, consumer magazine, a consumer magazine is intended for the general public and sold on newsstands or through subscription that are easily available to public. Trade magazine are aimed at people in certain professions. And thus, institutional magazine, corporation, nonprofits, and educational institutions frequently publish their own magazine since free to employees, students, and others interested parties. So newsletter is all their magazine categorized above classified publication according to their content and intended audience. This is John Ricky Zapanta reporting.
Thank you, Mr. Eugene and John Ree, for the Chapter 6 report. Now, let's hear for the Chapter 7 reporter.
Chapter 7 Radio and the Birth of the Electronic Journalism. I'll always pay attention to the parallel between the radio and the other media forms, especially to raging the digital media. Radio is a device used radio waves for broadcasting to all platforms. It is an emerging form of entertainment and information that actually useful for journalism. Let me tell you the history of radio. The beginning of magic medium. The origin of radio was traced to the theoretical physics. James Clerk Maxwell, a treatise on electricity and magnetism, was published on 1873. The radio was postulated the existence of electromagnetic phenomena. Radio finds a voice. Other inventors and experiments were integrated by radio. Reginald Fessenden, the inventor, believed the nature of on and off interrupted wave known as Morse code. Fessenden teamed up with F.W. Alexanderson to develop a device named alternator. This alternator would be able to transmit continuous wave. Early regulation. The Radio Act of 1912 first attempt to regulate radio. The Radio Act of 1927, the federal government came up with a body regulations that actually works, but it was suspended by the Communication Act of 1934. Radio after World War I. After several American firms resumed exploring the commercial possibilities of radio, American Marconi, an unwanted player of communication of sweepstakes, it was owned by British. Communication technology was important in foreign hands, so they create a new American corporation. This corporation was named Behemoth, established on October 1919. The Behemoth was the Radio Corporation of America. Radio carries a tone. The Westinghouse Company has a curved out and strong role in the communication. The electric power during World War I. The one who cracked the barrier between the competitive company of Westinghouse Company was Frank Conrad, the seventh grade education and one of the most valued employees. Conrad began to create a breakthrough of radio when Conrad starts to present programming every Saturday night using records from local music stores, and he also carried live saxophone and piano recitals. The Pitchboard Department runs a newspaper monitoring Conrad's programs picked up by the wireless set sale at the store for $10. In last week of October, the U.S. Commerce Department appointed the Westinghouse for the call letters KDKA. The Pitchboard Post agreed to telephone wire service on November 2, 1920. The KDK broadcast the election in United States. Radio KDKA, the coming chaos. Overall, the country, the radio became the greatest topic. Companies and entrepreneurs were opening up same radio stations as the manufacturers were turned out the radios as fast as they could. But Secretary of Commerce Herbert Over described these happenings as wireless fever. It is called the one of the most outstanding things that has come under my observation of American life. AT&T develops toll broadcasts. The first inkling of radio's news commercial potential came in 1922 by AT&T. The AT&T, their profits come from the charges made from the services, which called the toll broadcasting, where listeners would pay $50 for 15 minutes for airtime. This strategy originated in New York City with the call letters WEAF. It's up to the listeners for what they want to perform. It's either a lecture or a music on air. As the months progressed, companies paid for the privilege of getting message to the public by commercial broadcasting, which becomes the means of support for great majority of radio stations in United States. Exit AT&T. As radio commercial become very profitable, AT&T got out of radio business due to the resolution of tension was overdue, so the binding parties agreed to binding arbitrations against AT&T didn't fare well. This decision favored RCA, GE, and Westinghouse. As the decision flowed further, the phone company agreed to a plan under which they leave radio business, but they have the sole right to set up wired interconnection networks among stations. NBC and CBS. By mid-1920s, the significance and potential of radio broadcasting was apparent to all but the most die-hard skeptics. RCA, which has ignored Sarnoff presence, the music box memo just few years earlier, now they're really to take a big plunge. The RCA established permanent networks called the National Broadcasting Company. A few months later, NBC set up its secondary network called the original One Reed Network and dubbed one called the Blue Network. The federal government forced National Broadcasting to give the Blue Network because the government feared too much concentration in the hands of one company. The Blue Network change eventually called the American Broadcasting Company. National Broadcasting Company's competitors. National Broadcasting Company could look over its corporate shoulders and sees competition moving in by the struggling company called United Independent Broadcasters. As we know, National Broadcasting was become the king of the hill. They didn't worry much about its competitors. They think that no one overcome its leadership role in the broadcasting. WCAU in Philadelphia, an upstart firm, and luckily picked up dozens of stations, include the powerful War in New York City. All truth, it was not successful at the first, but because of the Columbia Phonograph Record Company invest enough money to keep the network afloat and rename it as the Columbia Phonograph Broadcasting System. Later on changed its name as the Columbia Broadcast System. CBS. The Columbia Broadcast System. William S. Paley, 26 years old, an executive in his family Congress Cigar Company, a firm who had done some advertising on WCAU and on CBS network. He was impressed by the power of radio advertising. With encouragement of Levis Paley, moved to New York as president of the Columbia Broadcasting System. Here at this site, Mandawa Bien Unido Bohol, I'm Samantha Claire Gilata, Bachelor in Communication 4. Back to you guys.
An American businessman and pioneer of American radio and television. Throughout of his career, he led the Radio Corporation of America in various capacity from shortly after its founding in 1998 until his retirement in 1970. According to an official biographer's story, Sarnoff can take the credit of notifying the world on April 14, 1912 that the luxury ship Titanic had struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank with a loss of more than 1,500 lives. Sarnoff allegedly stayed at his post for 72 hours with almost no food or rest, acting as the information link between the scene of the disaster and the mainland. William Paley grew up in comfort, unlike David Sarnoff, the man who would become his great business competitor. But Paley wasn't really satisfied as an executive in his family's cigar company. In the late 1940s, during the golden age of radio, Paley made a swift and dramatic move on NBC. Staging a talent radio and television, Paley was noted for his programming genius and his appreciation of talent. As a World War II approached, Paley supported established on a serious radio news operation for CBS. CBS News, initially in radio, then in television, became known as the premier broadcast news division. With the help of correspondent Edward R. Morrow and colleagues Eric Severin, Charles Collingwood, William Shiver, and others, CBS set journalistic standards for the broadcast industry. In the 1940s, the CBS developed color television. System lost out to the RCA version. In later years, CBS divested itself of most of their not very successful acquisition, deciding to concentrate on its core business. But like Sarnoff, Paley
Franklin D. Roosevelt. Americans became aware that Hitler must be stopped. Europe had been at war for years while America sat on the sidelines. Americans shaken by the devastation of World War I, justified wanted no part of another European conflict but the President Franklin Delano Roosevelt believed that America must enter the war and he used radio as a medium to present this view. Roosevelt recognized the value of radio and a mass medium with an intimate quality. Roosevelt was one of the most media-savvy of all presidents. He was the first to make extensive use of the press conference, and he also surrounded himself with advisors who were accomplished journalism and writers. He Congress act on the President's request and the United States went to war. Sons, brothers, husband, and the fathers volunteered or were drafted. The families who stayed behind relied more and more on radio to keep them in touch with developments. CBS at the end of World War II. By the end of the war, radio journalists had become proficient at gathering news that was starting in its immediacy. Morrow and second them of correspondent formed the nucleus of a news organization that would come to represent a major force of excellence in American journalism. CBS became the model for other networks as they developed worldwide news organization of their own. Radio news and radio entered the 1950s at a crest of power, prestige, and popularity, and then the roof fell in. Television lowers the boom. Television had been demonstrated at the 1936 World Fair. It was perfected in the 1940s and became a household fixture in the 1950s. Many in radio were openly skeptical of the possibility of television becoming a respected and respectable medium. The Jimny crushed radio like a steamroller. Performer who could be seen had much appeal than those who could only be heard. Television began to exploit its own variety of slapstick. Amy Kovacs is used special effects, often tying up breathtaking, expensive studios for hours to produce a visual that would last only a couple of seconds. Radio magic was gone. It simply could not compete with a medium like television. Radio's revival on the EPS side. One of the most dramatic illustrations of the Merrill's EPS elite popular specialized side of media radio, which started as an exclusive hobby for those who could figure out how to actually build one progress to a position of great prominence and mass audience appeal. When television proved superior in appealing to the mass audience, radio specialized, reaching a narrower audience who typically favored one type music. Television too is now entering a specialized stage with dozens of narrowly targeted cable channels. Radio's new strategy. Radio targeted its audience through airplay of recorded music song after song. In 1930s, when old announcer named Martin Black popularized the format in a program called like Make-Believe Ballroom, Black is credited with developing the modern Zest jockey format, which was later adapted into programs like Your Hit Parade, which played the most popular tones of the week and was in part responsible for the evolution of the top 40 format. The radio was generally an electric mix well into the 50s. Disc jockeys might play some classical followed by jazz, followed by big band, and then followed by essentially whatever the disc jockey wanted to play. Disc jockeys had developed considerable skill in wearing all this together. They motivate the talent of the emerging corps of disc jockeys was molded with a powerful new force rock and roll music and the lifestyle that went with it. Rock saved radio. As a rock evolved from rhythm, a blues, that youth of the nation became captivated with this new form of musical expression. Young people wanted more of a role in society, and coincidentally, they also were developing quite a bit of disposable income during these prosperous years. Radio stations since this new awakening, and as millions turned into the sounds of early rockers like Bill Haley and the Comets, Carl Perkins, and Ferlin Husky, radio programmers discovered something of enormous importance. Rock was lifestyle. It was a relatively easy format to implement. Even the thinnest radio station, all you have to do was read one of a number of record industry publications and play the top 40 most popular cuts. Radio had found a new and eloquent voice. Radio itself became a powerful force in the music world, so much so that some radio programmers engaged in a ethical and illegal practice called payola. In return for bribe from the record company, they would give a certain cut, heavy or radio tunes into its audience. Programmers became aware that enormous numbers of commuters were driving to and from work in the morning and evening, respectively, and once radios became commonplace in cars, the programmers exploited this lucrative dry time. Through the 1960s, methods of sampling the audience became more sophisticated and the distinctions among audience were fine-tuned. By the 1960s were perhaps for our 5-station and dominated a major metropolitan area. Now there were room for many because of the richer markets that had been discovered and cultivated. Almost all this growth came on the EM band. There were several reasons for this. The FM band had been available for years, but confusion over assigning frequencies had caused the technology to languish. An FM radio for your car was an expensive proposition, and home set equipped to receive FM often did not work very well. Once FM was perfect at home, EM enhanced fidelity primarily because the signal is less prone to interference and because of FM stations are assigned a broader range of frequencies, meaning that the signal can carry more sounds information or once unused, FM frequencies became dominant powerhouse. And EM suffered after incurring serve losses in the 1980s. EM radio station returned to relative health, many of them by programming talk and news, two formats that have continued to increase the popularity through the 1990s. The super-segmented format is the hallmark of modern radio, and we'll see how that approach is utilized later in this chapter. First, to a look at how radio works.
Respectively, and once radios became commonplace in cars, the programmers exploited this lucrative drive time. A station was usually known as Top 40 or Country and Western. Those that chose a middle path were called middle of the road. Through the 1960s, method of sampling the audience became more sophisticated and the distinctions among audience were fine-tuned. By the late 1960s, where perhaps 4 or 5 stations had dominated a major metropolitan area. Now, there were room for many more because of the niche markets that have been discovered and cultivated. But in the late 1960s, significant advances were made in the quality of receivers as well as the capability of stations to transmit a high-quality FM signal. Once FM was perfect, it outshone AM ensured sound fidelity, primarily because the signal is less prone in interference and because FM stations are assigned a broader range of frequencies, meaning that the signal can carry more sound information. Once unused, FM frequencies become dominant powerhouse and FM suffered. But after incurring severe losses in the 1980s, a radio station returned health, many of them by programming talk or news to formats that have continued to increase in popularity through the 1990s. Today, the super-segmented format is the hallmark of modern radio, and we'll see how that approach is utilized later. The working of radio. The mysteries of the radio wave confound for years, but through experimentation and theoretical prediction, they were able to identify and then demonstrate and then exploit this phenomenon. Understanding radio is important because today, radio promises to perform new functions, including letting our computers communicate without wires, transmitting voice and digital message to anyone, anywhere, and further, breaking down the concentrate of geography. Two types of modulation most applicable to broadcasting are AM and FM. Amplitude modulation. AM radio changes the amplitude of the raw wave to impress modulation signals upon it. The advantage of AM radio waves is that waves used to produce an AM signal travel great distance. The disadvantage of AM signal is that static is itself a type of amplitude modulation. An AM radio is quite vulnerable to static interference. A secondary disadvantage of AM radio, as it is the use in the country, is that the waves cannot be needed to measure the wave as part of a scientific experiment in order to tell the collage how high the range of the ripples were, how quickly they formed and disappeared, and how many ripples were produced per second. You would measure the wave in several places and chart the result in such a way that you could picture how many times in the ripples were produced per second. If you did many measurements, a simple exercise connect dots would produce a sine wave. Exactly the same representation is used to depict the positive and negative polarities and electricity and electromagnetic waves. When we said that an electromagnetic wave would not look like a sine wave, we discussed a sine wave's view of waves in water, which do indeed look like a sine wave. Water in this case produces motion that has an actual horizon when you find the right angle to view it. But water actually rises and falls when disturbed primarily because it cannot be compressed. Air thought can be compressed and sound is produced by compressions and rare functions of air molecules. If you measured air pressure around a sound source, you would find a series of compression and rare functions. They could be grabbed as a sine wave, and then as is about as close as we can come to visualizing an electromagnetic wave. Wave. The electromagnetic wave depicted as a sine is measured in three basic ways: frequency, amplitude, and wavelength. Frequency means how many times a wave goes through a complete cycle. If a wave goes through 60 cycles in 1 second, we see its frequency is 60 cycles per second. The modern abbreviation for cycles per second is Hg, named after Heinrich Hertz, because electromagnetic wave change cycles very quickly. Measurement in Hg cycles per second would become rather cumbersome because of the number of zeros we should need after such high numbers. Amplitude is the height of the wave, generally translated into power, the more powerful of the wave. Wavelength is the actual physical length of the wave. It's measured how long in distance it takes a wave traveling would be the wavelength. The only real use of wavelength you'll encounter in broadcasting, interestingly, is in the height of the transmitting antenna. A discovery that dates back to the days of Marconi revealed that radiates most effectively when it is the same height as the length of the wave it is radiating. But it was learned through experimentation that antenna that was a multiple of a wavelength, or in the case of the shorter waves. Most radio stations today use a quarter wavelength antenna. The antenna structure is 1/4 the length of the wave it is transmitting. Types of the radio waves. Radio electromagnetic waves have particular characteristics are the way the wave is modulated, the manner in which it travels. Wave is modulated when it is feeds through a device that controls the flow of electrons and shapes the signal. When you think of a wave as the term is used in the science, the first image that probably comes to mind is that of the familiar sine wave. That causes some confusion because if you could see a radio wave, it would not look like the sine wave. A sine wave is a graphic representation of wave measurement, not a picture of the wave. If you chuck a rock into a pond, it produces a surface of range and dips in the water. If you look sideways of water from eye level, you would see that ripples appear something like a sine wave. A great deal of separation was allowed between the frequencies on which stations were allowed to operate. Therefore, there is less bandwidth on which to modulate information. Frequency modulation. FM radio has a much wider bandwidth due to the way operating frequencies were assigned when the FM band was laid out. Also, FM is much less subject to static than AM. Frequency modulation is just what the name implies. The imprint of the program. Frequency modulation is just what the name implies. The imprint of the programming signal is placed on the carrier wave by altering the frequency of the carrier wave. Because the information is not carried by changes in amplitude, is much less subject to static inference. FM is much less subject to static interference. FM though does not carry long distance like EM because FM tends to travel in a line of sight. AM produces other types of waves that bounce off the top layer of the atmosphere and hug the contours of the ground. This is why EM radio waves of high frequency carry across ocean and continents. A wave with a high frequency will have a shortwave length. That is why so-called shortwaves, waves with a short wavelength, are useful for long-distance broadcasts. A shortwave transmitter produces waves that travel in all directions and skip great distance. It becomes extremely high, it tends to travel in a straight line and stay very tightly focused. Super high frequency waves such as microwaves can be sent extreme long distance as long as the receiving and transmitting antennas can see each other's. Into space, collected by an orbiting satellite and transmitted back to Earth. Reporting live here in Balasan, Trinidad, this is Rosely Archaga for TMC News. Good morning.
Yes, Kim, this is about radio works. By transmitting and receiving electromagnetic waves, the radio signal is an electronic current moving back and forth very quickly. A transmitter radiates this field outward via an antenna. A receiver then picks up the field and translates into the sound heard through the radio. In AM radio, the strength of the signal is changed to make the sound in FM frequency. The radio is the speed of the signal that is changed when you tone in your radio. The dial number indicates the kilo or megahertz at which the signal is being broadcast. Radio signal uses a specific frequency or how quickly the waves of the field move up and down hertz. A measurement of the number of wave cycle per second AM expressed in kilohertz, while FM radio is expressed in megahertz. The station power affects the range of the signal of how far it can travel. The strongest AM power allowed in the United States is 50,000 watts. And this is the about the radio station. I am Vincent Kindao. I'm your reporter. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Samantha Claire, Mel Chok, Sheila May, Rosalie, Vincent for the Chapter 7 report. You have just heard the latest news around the globe. Again, this is TMC News.